We'll pick up with Chapter 7 on page 415, and we're going to try and run through the end of the material for this particular quiz. Now keep in mind, this one kind of runs strange. We'll run all the way through page 436, which runs into what I call a unit. They're not necessarily labeled in that way, but it runs into a different section of the material. So do keep that in mind as you're preparing for this particular quiz. Chapter 7 talks a little bit more about culture. And what it's going to do is it'll focus on America as a whole, and then it's going to focus in on African American culture and how it's influencing not just African Americans but also America at large. So kind of keep that in mind as you go through. There's several things I'm going to point out to you instead of going through all the material. I do want to point out a few things so you know where to find it as you prepare for your test. I do want to make sure that you notice that Black Americans are on the move. They are not staying in the South. They are finally moving beyond post-slavery time period. They're now moving away. They're trying to find better lives for themselves and their family. What we see happen, though, is they're not just moving out west where you've got all that free land. They're moving north. They're moving into large cities. They're moving to Chicago and Detroit, New York, etc. And so a lot of these hubs are going to become central to Black culture. In that, I want to make sure and point out to you the NAACP. This is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. The NAACP, as you probably know, is still around today. Their interest and importance in American culture continues to be pervasive even today. But there's really important leaders that come out and work in the NAACP. For instance, you'd want to know W.B. Du Bois. His role in the NAACP is imperative as he becomes the first director of publicity. The first leader of the NAACP is James Weldon Johnson, and you want to know both those names. Make sure you read that particular paragraph on page 416 really carefully. It's a little strange in how it's laid out, but you need to make sure and know who those two guys are. Don't assume that when you hit leader and then right the next thing is Du Bois, that these are the same things. So make sure and read that really carefully, and if you can't quite catch on, listen to this lecture again. We also see A. Philip Randolph, who's going to play an important role in establishment of the Brotherhood of the Sleeping Car Porters. This is important as this is essentially a Black union. Another important figure is Marcus Garvey. I love Marcus Garvey as far as him historically. He is just quite a character. His place in Black history, I even remember feeling it when I was in high school eons ago, it seems like now. He was the guy that said, "Black is beautiful. You need to embrace your Black roots. Quit trying to be white," which was what we were seeing a lot of African Americans doing in this time period. And he really encourages Blacks to be true to themselves and true to their culture and true to their history. He also encourages them to consider moving back to Africa. Now, the irony here for me is incredible, because none of these Blacks probably, 99% of them, would have never lived in Africa. This is really quite a ludicrous idea, except for that many did buy into it. For the most part, this is a failed effort, but it does encourage Blacks to get out there and learn more about themselves and be excited about who they are and who they are culturally speaking. You also want to know Langston Hughes, an incredible member of the Harlem Renaissance who plays an important role in encouraging writing of Black patrons. He's just really important. You also want to know about Sinclair Lewis. He wrote a number of different works, not the least of which is Main Street, Babbitt, and Arrowsmith. So make sure and know him for your test and read about him. Also F. Scott Fitzgerald, which certainly we know about him today because of The Great Gatsby. I think most of you or several of you would have read that in high school. I'm not really sure anymore what your reading lists look like, but if nothing else, you heard about it more recently as far as the movie goes because of Leonardo DiCaprio. So make sure you know about him and his influence on American culture. You also have D.W. Griffith. Now he's important because he kind of permeates culture with his idea. It's kind of opposite of Marcus Garvey. He is the guy that does a movie called The Birth of a Nation, which really kind of glamorizes the KKK. In many ways, it sets the American public back quite a bit. But you also have The Jazz Singer, the first talking movie, talking motion picture, or first talkie. You also have Buster Keaton and Charlie Chaplin. These are incredible comedians that hit the big screen and play an important role in American culture. So make sure you read that particular chapter and learn a little bit more about what our culture looks like. Now on page 422, we move into the next introduction. Keep in mind, again, we're jumping forward in the action, and it talks a little bit about the bonus march. Now, post-World War, Americans that have come back from the war are basically saying we are veterans that are not being taken care of, and they're going through the depression like everybody else, and they're saying, now wait a minute, we're supposed to get some benefits in a couple of decades. Why are we having to wait so long? And so this is a big fight for them. Your book talks about Joseph Angelo, and I hope that you'll read that material on him on page 422, because he is this incredibly remarkable guy who participates in the bonus march, but he is a war hero that essentially has sold everything he's got to survive, and yet he still can't survive. Now, their story isn't much different than anybody else's, except for that they're war heroes. And so when they march on Washington and they set up camp there, they're essentially telling the Washington lawmakers, we want our money now. We don't want to wait for our grandchildren to be around when it happens. We need our money now, at least some of it. And so we see these bonus marchers go to Washington in hopes that they can somehow get through to Congress. It doesn't work, but their plight is noble and important, so do make sure you read that material. It's particularly devastating in the very end, so do make sure to read all of that. In Chapter 1, we get into the Depression and how we got to that point. Herbert Hoover, he is going to play an important part, as he had served in the Coleridge administration as the Secretary of Commerce. Certainly was not how he hoped to see this country go down. The problem of the Depression is one that he essentially inherits, but it haunts his entire presidency. And he ends up becoming one of the least liked presidents because of that. The couple things I want to point out from this particular chapter is the idea of buying on margin. This is where we get the idea of credit in the stock market. We're going to buy X number of shares of a product, and we just know it's going to go boom, and so instead of paying the $100 per share, I'm going to pay $10, and I'll give you the rest of the money when it goes boom. And we see countless Americans get involved in this practice, so when that bubble bursts, which you've probably heard that terminology from the news or someplace else, everybody owes money and nobody has any money. And so do make sure to read about that. We go through a huge boom as a country right after the World War is over, but when it goes bust big, and it's going to impact the country at large. Now, it too is a domino effect. We see it starting in Europe because the Germans cannot pay their war debts that have been imposed on them. And so if they can't pay their war debts, countries like Britain and France owe the United States money, and so they can't pay us. And when we can't be paid, then we are all in debt, and it's a huge problem. So do make sure you read that. Black Tuesday is October 29th, and it's the day that the market actually collapsed. And you want to know that for your test on page 429. Also, looking through this, we see kind of a detailed listing on page 430 of why we dropped. Number one was there was a significant drop in construction and auto sales. Up until this point, the part of that boom was that everybody's building a house and everybody's buying a car. Well, the thing was, among other reasons, Americans were building things to last. Well, if you've got a car that works, why would you buy another? People didn't think in the terms that we do now, that I'm ready to trade in, I'm trying to get something newer, cooler, better, whatever. And so we see that basically drop off. Number two, we see that the wealth of this particular era, it's not evenly distributed. You've got the wealthy, and then the rest of the people, all the way down to the dirt poor. And so that is a huge problem for us at large. Number three, the nation's credit structure. People are buying things on credit now, not having to pay, most of which was stocks. But if you needed a refrigerator for that new house you just built, no big deal. Just buy it on credit and you pay it when you can. And so there's all this debt. Number four, we see the demand for American goods fall off sharply. Before this point, Europeans were buying our goods like crazy because they needed it. But after the World War, they began to realize we need to be self-sufficient, which means that they're not needing us, which means that we're producing too much, which means that we cannot keep up with ourselves, or we're overproducing. Number five is the international debt structure, which I already mentioned. There is no savings, there's low earnings for Americans at this point, and so there is nothing that can prevent this crash, I think. In Chapter 2, this is the last portion you need to know before your test. This is where you see the Americans basically lay all the blame on Hoover. He's inaugurated on March 4th, 1929. When the crash came later that year, it's as if it's his fault, but we can know from looking back historically that this was a long time coming, particularly post-World War. I don't know that I personally would blame Coleridge. I don't know that I'd blame Harding necessarily, but there's probably a number of mistakes that led up to it. But a lot of that was culture, not just government policy. And this is all my opinion, so you can take it as you like. So do make sure you read through this. Several of you will find it very interesting. I'll admit to you, I'm a historian, not an economist, and so there's a lot of it that is difficult for me to explain. Partially because it's hard for me to completely understand. So do make sure to take your time to read it. It's important to notice in 1929, we see 600 banks closing. The following year, we're at 1,600 banks that have closed. And then the following year, in 1931, 2 years after the crash, we have 3,600 banks that are closed. Well, what's happened? There's no money in those banks, so that means that people have no money. The run on those banks emptied them like that, and now all these people have nothing, because there's not the money in the banks, which all these things will play into Roosevelt's New Deal in the next section. Do make sure to notice some of what Hoover did to try and recover the economy. The RFC, this is the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. You want to know that for your test. You also see the efforts of the Hoover Dam. This is to put Americans back at work and also to provide a service as far as water and power, etc. So do make sure and notice those things, as well as on page 437 it talks a little bit sardonically about Hoover and how he received all the blame for this. The Hoover blankets, the Hoover flag, the Hoovervilles, these are all named for poor old Hoover, as he's blamed for the Depression and the way Americans have to deal with that. We also see the change in what Americans do regarding this. We see Roosevelt come on the scene in a very substantial effort to try and encourage Americans. We don't have to be done yet. We can survive this, so do what it takes to survive. So do make sure to read that particular chapter, and hopefully you will be ready then for your next quiz. Good luck, and let me know if you've got some questions.